You did everything right. I mean, you saved a portion of every paycheck. You maxed out your retirement contributions. You bought the real estate when you were, supposed to.
Right. You follow the rules.
Exactly. You followed the entire blueprint that society handed to you for building wealth and achieving security. And mathematically, you are poorer today than you were 3 years ago.
It is honestly the ultimate rug pull. You spend decades constructing a financial foundation based on a very specific set of rules, and you are completely unaware that the rule book itself is being actively rewritten.
Rewritten in rooms you will never have access to, right?
Exactly. Rooms you're not invited into.
And that is the profound betrayal we are digging into today. We are looking at the quiet, invisible mechanisms that are actively erasing your assets.
Erasing them. Not like stealing them in a dramatic Hollywood heist kind of way, just quietly erasing them.
Yeah, so for this deep dive, we're pulling from a really fascinating presentation by a financial strategist named Emro. She's the founder of a platform called Relocate with Revenue.com.
Which is an excellent resource, by the way.
It really is. And her presentation is titled, Your Assets Are Being Quietly Erased. Here's the evidence.
Relocate with Revenue Podcast with Just and Jen.
A very heavy title.
Very heavy. But our mission today isn't to just drown you in dry economic theory. We are going to just sit here and talk about reserve currencies for an hour.
No, the goal here is to unpack the actual granular human mechanics of how wealth vanishes. We want to look at the human lives behind the data.
Right. And more importantly, we are going to scrutinize this growing movement of people who have decided to completely rig this game in their favor.
Because that term, quietly erased, it's really the linchpin of her entire thesis. When we think of wealth destruction, human beings are conditioned to look for an explosive event,
Like a crash.
Right. We look for the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse. We look for a localized housing crash with boarded up windows. A singular catastrophic failure.
But that's not what's happening now.
No, it's not. The erosion we are facing right now operates much more like an odorless gas. Your nominal net worth, so the actual number printed on your investment account statement or the Zillow estimate of your house, it might look exactly the same.
You might even go up.
Exactly, it might go up. But the purchasing power, the actual caloric energy of that money, is being hollowed out from the inside.
I think about it like someone sneaking into your house every single night and just, shaving a millimeter off your tape measure.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You keep measuring the piece of wood you're trying to cut, and it still says 12 inches.
Okay.
But the inch itself is shrinking. Your house is still, quote-unquote, worth $1 million, but $1 million buys half of what it did a decade ago.
A fantastic way to conceptualize it. The measuring stick is compromised. And Emro's presentation is highly effective because she completely bypasses the theoretical macroeconomics.
She doesn't get bogged down in central bank balance sheets.
Right. She anchors this concept in the lives of specific individuals. She forces us to look at the collateral damage of these monetary policies.
Okay, let's unpack this and get into the evidence. Let's look at the first scenario she presents. We are introduced to Marcus and Lynn.
From Toronto.
Yes, from Toronto. They are in their late 40s and early 50s. And in 2022, they made a financial decision that was treated practically as a religion in their demographic.
They bought a pre-construction condominium.
Yep, they bought pre-con.
And we really need to properly frame the psychological environment of Toronto in 2022 to understand this decision.
Because it wasn't just a casual purchase.
No, for over 20 years, the Canadian real estate market, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver, it basically defied every traditional law of economic gravity.
Yeah, you had an entire generation of investors and homeowners who had never experienced a sustained downturn.
Not a real one, no. So it wasn't just an investment. It was culturally perceived as a completely risk-free, high-yield savings account that you just happened to be able to sleep inside.
Which is wild when you say it out loud, but that was the mindset.
And that cultural entrenchment is dangerous. When financial advisors, the media, and your neighbors all reinforce the narrative that an asset class only appreciates, people stop calculating risks.
They start looking at carrying costs.
Exactly. They just look at how fast they can get leverage to buy in. So Marcus and Lynn put down a massive deposit on a condo that literally didn't exist yet.
Operating on the absolute certainty that by the time the building was finished, it would be worth significantly more.
Which brings us to the systemic shock. The rules of the game changed.
They changed fast.
Very fast. To fight inflation, the Bank of Canada initiated an extraordinarily aggressive tightening cycle. They raised their benchmark interest rate 10 times in a 16-month window.
10 times. That's just relentless.
They took it from 0.5% all the way to 5%.
Wow. Let's walk through the mechanics of how that policy shift detonates a pre-construction real estate deal, because I think people don't fully realize how vulnerable these contracts are.
Right. So in 2022, when Marcus and Lynn signed the contract, money was virtually free. A 0.5% interest rate means your monthly carrying costs on a massive loan are incredibly low.
You look at your budget, you project your income, and the math works beautifully.
But with pre-construction, you don't lock in your mortgage rate when you sign that initial contract.
That's the trap.
You secure the mortgage when the building is finished and the transaction officially closes, which might be 2 or 3 years later.
So they sign a contract to pay, let's say, $800,000 for this condo, assuming their mortgage rate will be somewhere around 1 or 2%. The building takes 2 years to complete. Now it's 2024. The building is done. It's time to close.
But the interest rate isn't 2% anymore.
No, it's 5 or 6%. The monthly payment they budgeted for has effectively doubled.
And it is worse than just a higher monthly payment. Because interest rates went up so violently, the purchasing power of every single buyer in the market just evaporated.
When buyers can't borrow as much, housing prices have to adjust downward.
Exactly. So now the bank sends an appraiser to look at Marcus and Lynn's finished condo in 2024. And the bank says, well, we know you signed a contract for $800,000, but in today's high-rate environment, this unit is only worth $700,000.
Ouch.
Yeah. And the bank says, we will only lend you a mortgage based on the $700,000 value.
Which means Marcus and Lynn are legally obligated to buy the condo, but they have a $100,000 shortfall that the bank absolutely won't cover.
Right. They have to come up with that cash out of pocket just to close on an asset that has already lost value,
while taking on a mortgage with a drastically higher interest rate.
This is the invisible erasure M. Rowe is highlighting. The data she pulls from TerraNet, which is Ontario's statutory land registry, is brutal.
What does the data show?
It shows that 1 in 4 properties bought in 2022 and sold in 2024 were sold at a loss.
1 in 4.
Yeah. The median loss for Toronto pre-construction condos was around $56,000. And the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, they documented potential capital losses of up to 6% on 2024 closings alone.
So Marcus and Lynn's retirement equity is essentially vaporized by a central bank decision made to correct an inflation crisis that they didn't even cause.
Right. They are paying the price for a systemic correction.
It's like playing financial musical chairs, and the central bank has total control over the music.
That's a great way to put it.
They crank the tempo up for a decade, encouraging everyone to borrow and build, and then they abruptly rip the needle off the record. Marcus and Lynn did what was considered universally responsible, and they are left without a seat.
The central banking mechanism is just blunt. They increase the cost of capital to slow down the economy, but the collateral damage isn't abstract. It is Marcus and Lynn having to drain their actual retirement savings to cover an appraisal shortfall on a depreciating asset.
But this is the element of their story that I find, honestly, deeply unsettling, and it speaks to human psychology. M. Rowe points out that despite the math turning entirely against them, Marcus and Lynn are refusing to sell.
Yes, they are holding on.
Even though their carrying costs, the mortgage, the condo fees, the taxes, have grown by 24% since 2022. The gap between what they pay every month and what the asset is actually worth is widening aggressively. And yet, they are holding on bleeding cash every month. Why endure a 24% spike in your monthly burn rate to hold on to a sinking ship?
What's fascinating here is that we are entering the territory of behavioral economics. Specifically, a profound cognitive bias known as loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
Right. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky actually won a Nobel Prize largely for mapping this out. Human beings do not process financial gains and losses rationally.
We're emotional creatures.
Exactly. We feel the psychological pain of losing $1 roughly twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of gaining $1.
So an objective spreadsheet says, you are losing thousands of dollars a month, cut your losses, sell the asset, and redeploy the remaining capital.
But the human brain says, if I sell, I am a failure.
Wow.
For Marcus and Lynn, selling the condo means they have to crystallize the loss.
What does that mean, crystallize?
It means it transitions from a theoretical paper loss to a permanent, unchangeable reality. As long as they keep making those agonizingly high monthly payments, they can tell themselves a story. They can say, the market always bounces back. We just have to weather the storm. We haven't actually lost the money yet.
But the reality is they're losing the money.
Mm.
They are losing it incrementally month by month in the form of unrecoverable interest payments and massive carrying costs.
Yes. They are sacrificing their liquid wealth to protect the illusion of their illiquid wealth.
That is so tragic.
The tragedy is that their cost of living is rising to defend an asset that is depreciating. They are caught in a pincer movement, and the central bankers who adjusted those rates are completely insulated from this reality.
Right, they look at a spreadsheet and see housing market cooling, inflation dropping.
Exactly. They don't see Marcus taking a second job at 52 to pay a 6% mortgage on a condo worth less than the loan.
This vulnerability isn't just about physical dirt, though. It's easy to look at Toronto and say, well, that's the risk of highly leveraged real estate.
Sure.
What if you avoid real estate entirely? What if you play it incredibly safe, avoid debt, and just build a solid, diversified retirement portfolio?
You would think you're safe.
You'd think you are insulated from that kind of localized physical asset shock. But that assumption is exactly what tripped up the next people in the presentation, David and Karen in Atlanta.
David and Karen represent the quintessential traditional path. David is 58, Karen is 56. He spent 30 years in logistics management.
Just a normal, hardworking couple.
They are the model of steady, relentless consistency. For decades, they sacrificed. They skipped the extravagant vacations, they drove their cars until the wheels fell off, and they funneled every spare dollar into a 401k. By early 2025, they had built that account to $340,000.
And the presentation makes a point of highlighting that $340,000. I mean, in the grand scheme of financial podcasts and wealth management blogs, that might not sound like a lot.
It's not venture capital money, no.
But for a logistics manager and his wife, that number is sacred.
Yeah.
It is the physical manifestation of 30 years of disciplined labor. It is their safety net.
They followed the cardinal rule of 20th century wealth management, which is stay the course, trust the broad market, and let compound interest do the heavy lifting.
They traded their present comfort for future security.
Trusting that the system would honor that sacrifice.
And then the system didn't. In April 2025, a sudden tariff announcement out of Washington triggered a massive, violent market reaction.
It was immediate.
The Dow dropped over 2,200 points in 2 days. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ fell more than 10%. And just like that, David's account value plummeted by $50,000 in a matter of weeks. MRO cites Fidelity data showing that average account balances fell 3% across the board in just the first quarter of 2025.
We really need to examine how a policy announcement hundreds of miles away instantly vaporizes the wealth of a logistics manager in Georgia.
Right, because David didn't do anything wrong.
When Washington announces sweeping tariffs, algorithmic trading systems and institutional investors instantly model the downstream effects. Tariffs mean higher costs for raw materials, disrupted supply chains, and likely lower corporate profit margins in the coming quarters.
And since David works in logistics, his sector's probably hit the hardest by those projections.
The algorithms dump the stock, the broad index funds plummet, and David's 401k, which is heavily weighted in those funds, just bleeds out $50,000.
He didn't make a bad stock pick. He didn't try to day trade crypto. He just went to work. And while he was commuting, a policy decision gutted his life savings.
The interconnectivity of paper wealth is a double-edged sword. It allows for massive diversification, sure, but it exposes you entirely to macroeconomic volatility. The people drafting the tariff policy in Washington are not calculating the granular impact on David's retirement timeline.
And that timeline is the crucial piece of this puzzle. Here's where it gets really interesting. MRO pulls a quote from an NBC News interview from that same period.
Oh, the woman from New Jersey.
Yes. They spoke to a 68-year-old retired health professional from New Jersey who watched her portfolio drop, and her reaction was chilling. She said, quote, "I'm just kind of stunned. We just sort of have to hope that we have enough time to recover."
That phrase, hope that we have enough time, it identifies the most critical vulnerability in the traditional investment model. It is the concept of a time deficit.
A time deficit.
Yes. When traditional financial advisors tell you to ignore the volatility and just stay the course, that advice is mathematically predicated on you having decades for the market to recover.
Right.
If you are 30 years old, a $50,000 market correction is largely irrelevant. You will keep buying into the market at lower prices, and compound interest will eventually smooth out the dip over the next 30 years.
But David is 58, Karen is 56, the woman from New Jersey is 68 and already retired.
They don't have a 30-year horizon. They are approaching what financial planners call sequence of returns risk.
Can you break that down for us? Sequence of returns risk.
It is the nightmare scenario for retirees. If the market drops violently right when you are preparing to retire or shortly after you retire, the damage is exponential.
Okay.
Let's say David needs to pull $2,000 a month out of his 401k to pay his bills. If the market is at an all-time high, he only has to sell a few shares to get that $2,000.
Because each share is worth a lot.
Right, but if the market just crashed by 15% due to a tariff shock, those shares are worth significantly less. Now, David has to sell a massive number of shares just to get the same $2,000.
And once he sells those shares at the bottom, they are gone forever.
Exactly. When the market inevitably recovers 2 or 3 years later, David won't participate fully in that recovery because he cannibalized his own portfolio just to survive the dip.
This is precisely the mechanism of wealth erasure.
He is forced to convert a temporary paper loss into a permanent actual loss just to cover his fixed cost of living in Atlanta.
Wow.
When his timeline compresses, the traditional advice to think long-term becomes entirely detached from his reality. The systemic decisions made by policymakers extend his working years without his consent.
It is an incredibly bleak realization. We have Marcus and Lynn trapped by the carrying costs of a physical asset in a single market being bled dry by central bank interest rates.
Yeah.
We have David and Karen exposed to the wild volatility of paper assets in a single currency. Their timeline destroyed by a political tariff announcement. You play by the rules, and the rules beat you.
But the presentation doesn't end there, thankfully.
Right. M. Rowe introduces a third path, a deliberate pivot. She introduces us to James.
James represents the paradigm shift here. He is a 54-year-old former mid-level tech professional who lived in Seattle for 12 years.
And he wasn't a CEO.
No, he was a standard high-earning professional. He had a solid savings rate and a growing 401k. But he observed the exact same macroeconomic forces acting on his wealth.
He watched the cost of living in Seattle skyrocket.
He watched the purchasing power of his dollar decline. But rather than relying on hope or enduring the slow bleed, James engaged in an entirely different mathematical strategy.
James realized that if you can't control the macroeconomic forces, you have to control your exposure to them. And he didn't just pack a bag and flee in a panic.
No, not at all.
The presentation details a highly methodical 18-month preparation phase. Before he ever surrendered his Seattle lease, before he ever left the country, he spent a year and a half transitioning his skills into a location-independent consulting practice.
He stabilized his revenue stream first.
Right.
The sequence of his actions is the blueprint. Only after the location-independent revenue was secured did he execute the geographic move.
Who did he go?
He relocated to Panama. By doing so, he maintained a U.S.-level income stream, but he injected that capital into an economy where his cost structure dropped by more than half.
That's huge.
He dramatically increased his disposable income and his savings rate instantly without having to negotiate a single raise or work a single extra hour.
And M. Rowe introduces this concept of the shield effect to explain what happened to James when that same April 2025 market volatility hit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really explains why he survived the shock.
Because James's portfolio took the exact same beating as David and Karen's. He didn't have a magical recession-proof stock allocation. His 401k dropped by 10%, just like everyone else's.
The distinction lies entirely in the pressure placed on the asset. Because James's cost of living in Panama was so dramatically lower than his previous life in Seattle, he had constructed a massive buffer between his monthly income and his monthly expenses.
When the market crashed, he didn't care.
He didn't need to draw down his principal to cover his rent or his groceries. He didn't have to sell depreciated assets at the bottom of the market.
He removed the pressure on the well. He could just look at the stock market, shrug, and let his portfolio sit there undisturbed for 2 or 3 years until it recovered. His daily reality was entirely insulated from the algorithmic panic on Wall Street.
He decoupled his earning power from his spending obligations, creating a structural defense mechanism against sequence of returns risk.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. The math makes sense in a vacuum. Removing pressure on the well is great, but we are looking at James, a mid-level tech professional, right? Of course a tech worker can build a location-independent consulting practice. Their entire industry is built on laptops and cloud servers. What about a construction manager? What about a nurse? What about a high school teacher?
It's a fair question.
Does this geo-arbitrage model completely exclude the vast majority of the working class whose jobs require a physical presence? It feels like a strategy reserved exclusively for the digital elite.
It is a vital critique, and we cannot dismiss the inherent privilege of certain skill sets. It is objectively easier for a software developer to transition to remote consulting than it is for a physical therapist.
Exactly.
But the fundamental premise MRO is advocating for revenue before relocation isn't strictly limited to writing code.
So walk me through how someone outside of tech actually executes this.
The transition requires a radical audit of your human capital. Let's take your example. If you are a construction manager, you possess immense knowledge of project management, cost estimation, and supply chain logistics.
Yep.
Can that knowledge be productized into consulting for international developers? Can you build a remote estimating business? If you are a teacher, the global demand for native English-speaking tutors, curriculum developers, and corporate trainers is massive.
Okay, I see.
It is not about taking your exact current job and doing it from a beach. It is about disaggregating your skills from your current physical job title and finding a market that values those skills digitally.
So it requires an entrepreneurial pivot, regardless of your background. It is a fundamental career reinvention.
Yes, and it is incredibly difficult. It requires immense discipline. But compare the difficulty of that 18-month pivot to the difficulty of Marcus's reality.
Working a second job in his 50s to pay a 6% mortgage on a depreciating condo.
Exactly. Which difficulty do you choose? M. Rowe uses an anecdote in the presentation. People look at the sheer scale of restructuring their entire financial and geographic life and ask, how do you even start an undertaking like that?
Like eating an elephant.
Right. And her answer is, you just start. The 18 months are going to pass regardless.
You can spend the next 18 months watching your purchasing power erode. Or you can spend those 18 months laying the bricks for an exit strategy.
And the data shows a staggering number of people are choosing the latter. It is not a fringe movement anymore.
Not at all. M. Rowe cites data from Henley and Partners, one of the premier international migration advisory firms. They recorded a 30% year-over-year increase in Americans planning to move abroad heading into 2025.
30%. And that is just people planning to move. The more severe metric she highlights comes from the U.S. Federal Register, which tracks formal expatriations.
Wait, like giving up citizenship?
Yes, they recorded a 102% jump in formal expatriations in the first quarter of 2025 alone, a 102% increase.
Why formal expatriation? I mean, moving abroad is one thing, but formally renouncing your citizenship is an incredibly extreme step. Why are people going that far?
Because the United States utilizes a citizenship-based taxation system, unlike almost every other country on Earth, which uses territorial taxation.
Right.
If you are an American citizen living in Panama, earning money in Panama, you still have to file and potentially pay taxes to the IRS in the United States.
That sounds exhausting.
There are foreign earned income exclusions, but the compliance burden is massive. Laws like FATSIA force foreign banks to report American accounts back to the IRS, making it incredibly difficult for expats to even open a local bank account.
So the system is basically designed to keep a tether on your capital, even if you physically leave.
Exactly. And that 102% jump in renunciations indicates that high-earning individuals are calculating the lifelong cost of that tether and deciding it is mathematically advantageous to sever it permanently.
Wow.
They are severing the ultimate vulnerability, which is the jurisdiction of a government over their wealth. It proves M. Rowe's point that this isn't about running away to find cheap margaritas.
It is a cold, calculated, structural migration. People are running the numbers, realizing the math of their home country is fundamentally broken, and running toward jurisdictions where the math is favorable. This brings us to the core philosophy of her presentation. She synthesizes James's success into 3 distinct principles of financial sovereignty. Let's break these down, because they represent the actual toolkit for fighting asset erosion.
Principle number 1 is geographic diversification.
We saw the catastrophic failure of ignoring this with Marcus and David.
Exactly. If your job, your real estate, your bank accounts, and your retirement portfolio are all tethered to a single country, a single central bank, and a single currency, you have engineered a single point of failure.
You're standing on a stool with one leg. If the Bank of Canada decides to fight inflation by crushing demand, your real estate equity vanishes. If Washington decides to initiate a trade war, your 401k plummets. You have absolutely no structural defense.
Geographic diversification is the act of adding legs to the stool. James decoupled his revenue from his location. He earns in a strong currency, but spends in an economy where that currency commands massive purchasing power.
He moved his capital into different jurisdictions with different banking systems and different regulatory environments.
A policy shock in Washington might affect his stock portfolio, but it doesn't affect his rent in Panama or his local banking stability.
It's risk mitigation on a sovereign level, which feeds directly into principle number 2, and we've touched on this, but MRO stresses it as a non-negotiable sequence: revenue before relocation.
The failure rate of expatriation is heavily tied to people violating this exact sequence. They burn out at their job, they sell their house, they move to Costa Rica with a pile of savings, and they figure they will, sort it out when they get there.
So what does this all mean? I call that the Eat, Pray, Love financial plan.
It's a great name for it.
It is a fantastic lifestyle change and an amazing vacation, but it is not a financial strategy because eventually the savings run out.
Always.
And when you are forced to find local employment in an economy designed around a lower cost of living, your earning power is decimated. You are suddenly competing in a local labor market where the average wage might be $800 a month.
Relocating with revenue is what turns a lifestyle flex into a financial fortress. Establishing the income stream first gives you total leverage. You aren't migrating out of desperation, you are migrating as a capital allocator,
You get to scan the globe and choose a jurisdiction based entirely on where you are treated best.
where the tax structures are optimal, where the healthcare is high quality and affordable, where the infrastructure supports your digital business. You arrive from a position of absolute strength.
Which sets up the final and I think the most powerful concept in the presentation. Principle number 3. Your cost structure is your most underrated asset protection tool.
This flips traditional financial planning completely on its head. The entire financial services industry is focused on accumulating a larger pile of assets.
We are obsessed with the top line. How much is in the 401k? What is the house worth?
But MRO forces us to look at the burn rate required to sustain the life around those assets.
Let's run the math on this because it's fascinating. Let's look at Toronto. If a family's baseline carrying cost, the mortgage, the property tax, the insurance, the groceries, the utilities, the car payments, if all of that requires $6,000 a month just to keep the lights on, they are incredibly fragile.
Highly fragile.
Every dollar they earn, every dividend their portfolio produces is instantly consumed by that massive structural overhead. If they lose a job, or if interest rates spike and that 6,000 becomes 8,000, the entire machine grinds to a halt.
They have no margin.
None. They're running on a treadmill at a sprint, and if they trip, they get thrown off.
Now contrast that structural fragility with James in Panama, or someone utilizing geo-arbitrage in Thailand or Portugal or parts of Eastern Europe. If a highly comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle in those jurisdictions costs $2,000 a month, and you maintain a location-independent income of $8,000 a month, you've engineered a massive delta. Yes, the delta is the mathematical gap between your incoming revenue and your required structural expenses.
So you have a $6,000 a month surplus.
Rowe argues that this delta is your true safety net. It is a far more robust defense mechanism than hoping your index funds beat inflation. Because if a global recession hits and James's consulting revenue drops by 40%, his income falls from $8,000 to $4,800.
Which would be catastrophic in Seattle.
In Seattle, a 40% pay cut would be an existential crisis resulting in foreclosure. But in Panama, with a $2,000 cost structure, James is still saving $2,800 a month during a massive recession.
His lifestyle doesn't change.
He doesn't have to liquidate his retirement accounts to buy groceries.
His cost structure acts as a shock absorber. This completely reframes the idea of moving abroad. You see it on Instagram, and it looks like a vanity project. People posting pictures of their laptop by a pool in Bali.
Right.
But strip away the aesthetics. Beneath the surface, geo-arbitrage is a hardcore mathematical defense mechanism. It is asset protection achieved through systemic efficiency.
It is arguably the most effective way for a normal person to combat the unseen erasure of wealth we discussed at the beginning. You can't stop the central banks from printing money. You can't stop the politicians from initiating trade wars.
But you can unilaterally lower the drawbridge on your required living expenses, making you almost entirely immune to the inflation and volatility happening in your home country.
The theory is bulletproof. The logic is incredibly sound.
But the execution is where people freeze. How do you actually untangle your life? How do you figure out the cross-border tax implications? How do you set up an international corporate structure?
Roe knows this is the bottleneck, which is why her platform, relocatewithrevenue.com, is built around implementation, not just theory.
Right. The presentation outlines the philosophical approach her platform takes to solve these massive friction points. She isn't just selling a motivational seminar. She is providing architectural blueprints for a financial restructure.
And she has specific tools for this. She offers an 82-page digital relocation blueprint.
82 pages.
It's comprehensive. It covers 5 core modules: the Income First Framework, the Relocation Readiness Assessment, business structure for location independence, and cross-border financial mechanisms.
What I found most compelling is how they use technology to mitigate the fear of the unknown. The presentation discusses the use of an AI tool, the Blueprint Mirror AI tool, to essentially stress test an individual's life.
The conceptual tool she refers to, modeling a user's specific situation against complex variables, is crucial. When you contemplate a move across borders, the human brain cannot accurately compute all the variables.
There are just too many.
What is the tax treaty between the U.S. and Portugal regarding capital gains? What happens to my specific health insurance requirements? How does exchange rate volatility impact my purchasing power over a 5-year horizon?
If you try to calculate that on a legal pad, you will literally just give up.
The platform's methodology involves plugging an individual's microeconomic data, so their current assets, their revenue streams, their dependents, their healthcare needs, into a framework that tests those variables against dozens of international jurisdictions.
It takes the emotional panic out of the decision and replaces it with cold, actionable data. It provides a mathematical answer to the question, will this actually work for me?
And beyond the modeling, there is the strategic human element. The presentation mentions that her team conducts 1-hour deep dive strategy sessions because the numbers are only half the battle.
The other half is the logistical execution.
How do you legally structure the consulting business so you aren't double taxed? How do you maintain banking relationships in strong currency jurisdictions while living in a developing economy?
They are essentially acting as the chief financial officer for a family's international transition. They map out the sequence we discussed earlier, stabilize the revenue, structure the entity, optimize the tax residency, and finally, physically relocate. It is a highly engineered process.
It has to be. You can't leave this to chance.
Which brings me directly to you listening to this right now. Roe ends her presentation with a challenge, and I think it is the most important question we can ask today. Think about the 3 case studies we spent the last hour dissecting. I want you to be brutally honest with yourself about your current exposure.
It's time for a self-audit.
Exactly. Are you, Marcus and Lynn, are you tethered to a massive, illiquid physical asset in a single market, watching your carrying costs aggressively outpace your equity? Are you trapped by loss aversion, paying a premium every month just to avoid admitting the market turned against you?
Or are you David and Karen?
Have you played the good soldier, shoveling money into paper assets in a single currency, completely exposed to the whims of algorithmic trading and political policy? Are you hoping, praying, that you have enough time left on the clock to weather the next inevitable systemic shock?
Or are you ready to become James?
Are you willing to embrace the friction of restructuring your human capital, prioritizing location-independent revenue, and aggressively utilizing your cost structure as a shield against asset erasure?
Naming your current vulnerability is the prerequisite to defending against it. If you do not accurately diagnose your exposure to the system, you cannot build a strategy to exit it.
So, to synthesize this massive paradigm shift we've explored today, we started with the silent, insidious mechanics of asset erasure. We broke down how inflation, interest rate manipulation, and macroeconomic policy shocks systematically dismantle wealth built on traditional advice.
We looked at the tragic collateral damage of central banking decisions on everyday people.
But we didn't stop there. We mapped out the highly rational, proactive mathematics of geo-arbitrage. We proved that by prioritizing revenue-first relocation and drastically widening the delta between your income and your living expenses, you can build a financial fortress that is largely immune to systemic volatility.
The evidence is overwhelming. The data on expatriation and the surge in global mobility proves that this is a structural evolution in how high-earning individuals protect their labor.
And as a quick footnote, Roe mentioned at the end of the video that her next area of focus is going to be on how to execute this relocation ethically. which I think is incredibly important, ensuring that this influx of capital doesn't displace local populations or exploit developing economies.
So we will definitely be keeping an eye out for that framework. It is a necessary conversation.
Absolutely.
But as we conclude our analysis of the evidence today, there is a massive, looming question that this entire phenomenon forces us to confront. A macro-level implication that wasn't explicitly resolved in the presentation.
Laid on us.
We have spent an hour establishing that the systems controlling your cost of living, the valuation of your assets, and the timeline of your retirement are fundamentally out of your control. If that is true, at what point does participating in traditional, safe investing within a single jurisdiction actually become the most reckless gamble you can make?
That's a terrifying thought.
Furthermore, consider the macroeconomic feedback loop. If millions of the most productive, high-earning individuals recognize this reality and they adopt geo-arbitrage to systematically extract their wealth and their tax revenue from these high-cost Western economies, how will those traditional single-market governments adapt when their primary tax base simply packs up their laptops and leaves?
That is the terrifying next chapter. The finish line isn't just moving away from us anymore. People are waking up, doing the math, and simply walking off the track to find a completely different race.
Relocate with Revenue Podcast with Just and Jen.